So that was a social experiment, because whenever I try this with secondary or primary people, they never be quiet, but I knew early childhood people would react right away. Thank you. My name is Jim Waterston and I'm the Dean of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all along tonight for what will be a wonderful occasion. We were just saying as we came in, when you go in and visit a school or an early childhood centre, you can tell the quality of the school or the centre by the quality of the noise. And the noise outside was just absolutely first class. So I know we've got a great group with us tonight. As the appropriate way to start tonight, we'd like to welcome Aunty Georgina Nicholson to give us the welcome to country. So welcome, Aunty Georgina.
So thank you, Jim, for this here, yeah. Womanjika, wow, it's full in here. Wow. Welcome, everyone. Hello, my name is Georgina Nicholson and I am a proud Wurundjeri woman. Wurundjeri being part of the Kulin Nation. The Kulin Nation consists of 5 clans, and they are Wurundjeri, Boonwurrung, Wathaurong, Tanarong and Djajarwurrung. Wurundjeri being all of Melbourne CBD and surrounding country, extending north to the Great Divide, east to Mount Baw, south to Mordialloc Creek and west to the mouth of Werribee River. So I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to our ancestors who walked this land as free spirits, to our elders past, present and future, to all Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today and other elders. I would also like to acknowledge the Dean, Professor Jim Waterston, and Jenny and John Leeper down the front here. It was lovely to meet you. And their beautiful daughter, Fran Leeper. So a nice little family there. Lovely to meet you too. And the guest speaker, we've got it right at the front here, from Harvard. Wow. Like, legally blonde, I've got to say it, Legally Blonde. Who's seen that movie? That's how I think of it. I love that movie, you know. Well, if she follows the man there thinking she can get him back, got to go to Harvard, but she ends up being the solicitor or whatever. What do they call it? The barrister or something?
Oh, lawyer.
Lawyer, yeah, that's it. You can tell I know a lot about things. Yes, so she gained a lot in that. So guest speaker, Mara.
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. Womanjika Wurundjeri Balak Yemen Kundibik. So I would just like to tell you what I've said in our Woiwurrung language, and that is welcome to the land of the Wurundjeri people. So my mother, Martha Margaret Nicholson, nee Terrick, was delivered by her grandmother, Granny Jemima, and that was under a tree on Corrandirk, Aboriginal mission near Healesville. So our mother was already learning the importance of family and culture. Years later, our mother met a deadly Irishman, and his name was Patrick. And they met on a blind date in Melbourne in the early 1930s. In 1937, Mummy and Daddy were married. Back then it was in a registry office, and they had 16 children. Wow. Yeah, I reckon 2, Fran. Wow, it's a wow factor. So out of the 16 children, there was 8 boys and 8 girls, and no twins, so no cheating. And if anyone's had twins, I'm sorry. If anyone's had twins, I'm really sorry, though I don't mean that in a nasty way, I mean it in a funny way. So the 16 children, I'm the baby of the 16, or the youngest, and the oldest is my sister Pat Ockwell. Pat Ockwell is an amazing senior active elder. She turned 82 this year. So that is a real milestone for an Indigenous woman to reach that age. For they say our age gap, with other cultures, don't live as long. It's about a 12 to 15 year gap. It's pretty sad, isn't it? Oh, it makes you, think, gee, life goes so quickly anyway. But Sister Pat, I'd just like to talk a little bit about her because she is amazing for her age. She's had a very big operation and she's recovering from that. But she has done so much in her many years of work. She's managed several Aboriginal hostels. She's worked for Aboriginal housing for many years. She's on many boards, committees. She's just very, very active and involved with peoples. She used to foster children years ago. She is a great advocate for, justice, land rights, housing, like I said. So Sister Pat gave up her dreams because she wanted to be in the Olympics as an athlete. And she gave up her dreams to stay at home with Mummy and looking after all the babies coming. Because Daddy was in the Air Force back then and he had to keep taking leave. So he ended up getting a job in the local sawmill in Healesville. And back then he rode a push bike. Yeah, it was before we could get a car. So how's that, eh? I think he dinked Mummy on the bike a few times, but before all the children came along. But sadly, both my parents have now passed away and there's only 8 of us kids alive. And out of 16, that's a huge, huge gap, So we must carry on the culture for our people. This is what I'm trying to do, what I do here with the welcomes. I'm doing it for my mum, for her mum, which is my grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, and many people that have been here before me to get up and do what I do, and most importantly for our future generations, because they're going to keep it going for us, and there's a lot of them. So Aboriginal culture is the oldest living resilient culture there is. It dates back to 80,000 years plus. So, we've been here a long time, even though we weren't sort of counted by the government back then, but we're here. We've always been here, and it's always been Aboriginal land. So I'm sure a lot of, like the university, I'm really happy to do welcomes for the university because they acknowledge our struggles, they acknowledge who we are, and that's very respectful. So I thank Melbourne University for that. So we do have an office at the Abbotsford Convent in the Gold Leaf building. So if you're ever in the area and you want to pop in during work hours, if you want to pop in and have a cuppa, you'd be more than welcome. We have a lot of staff there. My sister works there. A lot of non-Indigenous staff, but they're very clever people. And they're a good bunch of people. So I might leave it there because you've got a big agenda to get through. And I must excuse myself. I'm going to leave now. Normally I'd stick around, but to listen to the, lectures and stuff. But thank you very much and have a lovely evening. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Auntie Georgina, for that really warm and generous welcome to country. We all feel, I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everyone, we all feel very honoured to be on Wurundjeri land tonight, and we thank you for being here. I really appreciate it, and we know you've got another commitment, so thank you very much. Okay, tonight is the inaugural Jenny Leaper lecture, as we've had the Leaper family introduced, but welcome along to Jenny and to John and to Fran. We really appreciate you being here and certainly appreciate your generous support and contribution to the work that we're doing in the early childhood area here at Melbourne University, which we hope will benefit young people right around this country and internationally. So it's a great occasion tonight to celebrate your contribution, but to celebrate the launch of the Research in Effective Education in Early Childhood Hub, the acronym being the REEaCH Hub. And so this is, as I said, our launch and a really meaningful opportunity for us to engage with stakeholders to talk about the most important education sector in the lifelong learning journey. So can I ask you just to acknowledge and applaud John and Jenny for their contribution to that. There are so many wonderful people here. It would be most of the evening if I was to go through and introduce you all, and acknowledge you all. So can you all just please feel welcome? Having said that, I would like to introduce one person. I'd like to introduce Gabrielle Sinclair, who's the CEO of ASEQA, which is the Australian Children's Education and Care Equality Authority. Got that out finally, Gabrielle. The only reason I wanted to acknowledge Gabrielle above everyone else is because 3 years ago, when I was the Director of Education in Queensland, Gabrielle was the Deputy Director General of Education in Queensland for early childhood. And it was the first appointment ever made, and to my knowledge, I'm not sure there's any Deputy Director Generals or Secretaries that have ever been appointed in state departments. And so Gabrielle was ahead of her time and did such an amazing job to promote early childhood nationally and across Queensland. And so I just wanted one chance from my perspective to acknowledge the great work you did. So thank you, Gabrielle. Tonight's session is titled as The Future of Children's Learning, and we'll hear, as we heard before, Mara Krechevsky from Harvard University to speak to us. Mara is a research director at Project Zero at the Harvard University and will present Making Learning Visible in Early Childhood Settings. Melbourne Graduate School of Education is well known for visible learning, so it's nice to know that you'll be staying with that theme. Our own Professor of Early Childhood, the amazing Nicola Yelland, will then respond to Mara's presentation, and then Patricia Eadie, Associate Professor Patricia Eadie, who is the Director of the REEaCh Hub, will then conclude this evening's proceedings, and we look forward to all three of you speaking. Now, they asked me to say a few words about early childhood in this part. We've gone for a fair while, so I'll just condense that. But I don't think I deserve any accolades, but not many people move out of early childhood and take on senior roles within education, certainly in this country. I was an early childhood teacher for 7 years, so I know a little bit about it. I know how hard it is. I know the science behind early childhood teaching, and I know the challenges that are involved in it. And so the couple of things I wanted to say about early childhood in this country that still bother me and that we need to work on together, and this opportunity to galvanise behind the REEaCh Hub provides us with a much stronger voice than we would otherwise have. One of the problems with early childhood, as you know, is it's an isolated profession and people work in small teams, and we don't get time to collaborate, to use our voice to talk to Australia about the research and the funding that's required to promote the amazing work that is early childhood. I've said it many times in my life, and I'll say it one more time. The answer to every problem in our country and in our problems of practice is early childhood. If it's about Year 12 retention, then invest in early childhood. If it's about building the economy, then invest in early childhood. The problem with investing in early childhood is you don't see a return on investment within the term of a government electoral cycle. And so we have a problem in this country, especially, and I'm sure in other countries, but more so knowledgeable around Australia, we have a problem that it's easier to invest in senior secondary assessment, or it's easier to invest in things that pay an immediate dividend than to focus on an investment rather than a cost in early childhood. And I feel very passionate about the fact that it's people like us who should be advocating on behalf of the profession. The other problems with the profession are that we don't pay our people enough, and of course then they live a hand-to-mouth existence, working inordinate hours and focusing such generosity and love into the early childhood sector to prepare young people for a really difficult and challenging life ahead. I just use one personal anecdote that my mother was in the audience once before she passed away when I was talking to a big group of people like this, and I mentioned that I was the first person from my family to go to university. After the lecture, she took me aside and said, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but you were the first person in our family to go to kindergarten, and that made the difference. And so I've always been acutely aware ever since that it probably was the kindergarten rather than the university that made me the person that I was. The last bit before I do hand over is we do need to work together to make sure, and Gabrielle has been acknowledged already, and with the regulator in Australia, we do need to make sure that we not only regulate square meterage and safety precautions and to ensure that we have conditions suitable for young people to be in early childhood, but we need to regulate quality. We need to focus on making sure that the very best pedagogy that we know about is invested in and used in our early childhood environments to make sure that every young person gets the start that they need. The last point I want to make, and I heard it on the radio this morning, and I certainly respect Pasi Solberg immensely. He's in Australia now working with the Gonski Institute, and he was interviewed by the ABC and talked about his book on play-based learning. We are all, I'm sure, advocates of play-based learning, but people outside of early childhood don't understand it, and they think that play-based learning, anyone could do that. How hard could it be to look after young people and get them to play well together? And of course, we don't talk about the knowledge, and as I said before, the research and the science that goes into teaching early childhood. And if that's done well, then everything flows after that. And again, I'll promise not to make too much of a fuss of you, Gabrielle, but when we encountered that problem in Queensland, Gabrielle very astutely came up with the idea of appropriate pedagogies rather than play-based learning. And as soon as we started talking about that in the next 2 or 3 years, suddenly there was a lot more interest and a lot more of focus from government and across Queensland around what it takes to be a great early childhood program. That's probably enough between the Welcome to Country and myself. We've probably taken up our time, but I wish you well tonight. I'm really pleased to introduce now Mara and let you know that she is a senior researcher at Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and she's currently the project director of Making Learning and Thinking Visible in Italian secondary schools, a cross-cultural collaboration to adapt Project Zero frameworks in Italian secondary schools, and a researcher on the Pedagogy of Play project. Maybe that's Pedagogy of Appropriate Pedagogies project. A collaboration with the Lego Foundation and the International School of Billund, Denmark, to develop pedagogy for supporting learning through play from preschool to middle school. Mara has been conducting educational research for 30 years, including Making Learning Visible, an investigation into documenting and assessing individual and group learning from preschool to high school, based on collaborative research with educators from Reggio Emilia. Mara was the project director of Project Spectrum, a 10-year research project implementing multiple intelligence theory in early childhood. Mara has also co-authored numerous articles and books, and we are incredibly fortunate to have her here with us tonight, and I'd like to invite you to the stage. Thank you, Mara.
Thank you very much, Dean Waterston. I was thinking, what is that on my neck or something? And I realized it's a little arrow from the computer. So I just move that. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. I would also like to thank Tricia Eady and Jenny Leeper, sorry to mention your name so many times, for the opportunity to talk about the future of children's learning, a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Before we begin, I would like you to take out a piece of paper, or you can use your electronic device, and jot down your response to the following question. It is early spring. Imagine you are taking a walk with a 4-year-old child when the child turns to you and asks, "How do leaves get back on trees?" How might you respond? So just jot your response down on a piece of paper. Once you have jotted down that response, I'd like you to turn to the person next to you and share what you might say. Unfortunately, we can't have roving mics here because I'm dying to find out what you would say, but I will be returning to this at the end of the talk. So I have been conducting research actually at Project Zero for over 35 years, and without a doubt, the Making Learning Visible research, which I'm going to focus on tonight, has been the project that has been the most provocative in terms of challenging my own assumptions, values, and beliefs about teaching and learning. Learning about another culture is often useful because other cultures act as a kind of mirror for our own beliefs and values. Even if we don't end up agreeing with the theories and practices of another culture, the encounter forces us to confront our own biases and to become clearer about why we do what we do. So my goal this evening is not that you necessarily agree with everything that I say, but for you to begin to question some of your own assumptions, beliefs, and practices. I want to begin with an anecdote from the Keith School in Indianapolis in the United States, which was the first school that used Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And teachers at this school used to interview children when they entered kindergarten and each of the following years, and then they would put this, and they'd videotape it, and they'd put it together in a kind of video portfolio. And one question that they asked each child was, why do you go to school? And one little boy, when the teacher asked him, why do you go to school, looked up at her with great concern and said, I thought you knew. So I love this anecdote, and I do find it funny, but I also think it speaks to what my colleague David Perkins calls the relevance gap. So in the United States, maybe here, we often talk about the achievement gap. But my colleague Dave Perkins says we need to make more connections. There's a relevance gap, and we need to be able to make more connections between school and what he calls life-worthy learning. So while changes in globalization and the workplace highlight the ability to learn and function as part of a group, in many schools still, the focus of almost all assessment and much of instruction is on promoting individual performance and achievement. In and outside the classroom, thinking and learning are generally considered individual rather than social and communicative acts. The Making Learning Visible project draws attention to the power of the group as a learning environment and documentation as a way both to make learning visible but also to change the nature of the learning that takes place. So in the next half hour or so, I'm going to give you an overview of the research project. We are going to dive into an example of a learning group in early childhood called the City of Reggio. I will share some features of what we think makes learning experiences like that so powerful, and then I'll have a few closing thoughts. Is anybody here not familiar with Project Zero? Raise your hand if you don't know what Project Zero is. Okay, so Project Zero is a research group at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and we've been investigating the development of learning processes in children, adults, and organizations for over 50 years. We have many different kinds of research projects. We address questions like, what does it mean to teach for global competence? What would it mean to put play at the heart of learning in schools? And one that Howard Gardner has spent a number of years looking at, what is the value and meaning of a degree in liberal arts and sciences in the 21st century? So we have many different projects, but one thing remains constant. We are always asking the same three questions. And those questions are, what does learning look like? How and where do thinking and learning thrive? And what we sometimes refer to as the $10 billion question, what is worth understanding today and tomorrow? So tonight I'm going to be focusing on the first two questions, but inevitably we will also be addressing the third. Okay, how many people here are familiar, or let's say not familiar with the Reggio Emilia preschools? Raise your hand if you're not familiar with the Reggio Emilia preschools. Okay, great. I mean, not great, but I can give this part of the talk. So the Reggio Emilia is a town in northern Italy of about 170,000 people. And in this town, there is a set of 34 municipal preschools and infant toddler centers that serve children from 3 months to 6 years old. For over 50 years, teachers in these schools have been working with children, carefully researching and documenting their individual and group learning. The psychologist Jerome Bruner, when he first stepped foot into a Reggio preschool classroom, he said, "I felt like I was walking into a graduate seminar." One of the most striking aspects of the Reggio approach is a question that Reggio educators have posed from the very beginning, and they are never done answering. What is your image of the child? Reggio educators see children as powerful protagonists of their own learning who are able to think and communicate in a variety of ways, and they use a metaphor of 100 languages of children. If you were to go into any classroom in a Reggio preschool, you would see some form of documentation taking place. It might be a teacher with a camera or jotting down notes, or maybe it's a video camera, or maybe children have the camera. But documentation is very important for them, not just, as I was saying, to make learning visible, but because it informs where teachers go in their next steps. So in Reggio, they see schools as sites of pedagogical research, places to understand, support, and document learning. And everybody, from the children to the kitchen staff, to the teachers, to the administrators, to the families, is seen as contributing to this culture of research. The quality of the work that the children produce is extraordinary. And just to give you an example, this is an image of one of the theaters in the city. And when they needed a new theater curtain, they invited one of the preschool classrooms to design the theater curtain. And this is what the children, with the support of the adults, designed. It's now hanging in this theater called Ring of Transformation. But along with this contribution to the community, they also wrote this book, Theater Curtain, that describes the learning processes that both children and adults went through, as well as including reflections from children and adults. So in the Making Learning Visible collaboration, which began around 20 years ago, we posed 2 questions. First, when does a group become a learning group? We're in a group right now. Would you consider this a learning group? Maybe, maybe not. Does group learning mean something besides what a collection of people learn as a result of having collaborated in a group? Or might you say that there's a way in which you could say the group holds knowledge that's larger than what any one individual has learned? And in schools, does group learning only refer to what the children learn? Might it refer to what teachers or parents learn? And in Reggio, they refer to this as a pedagogy of relationships. The second question, which I've already alluded to, was about how documenting learning can support and shape future learning. And they refer to this as a pedagogy of listening. So this was a project that was not just about group learning and not just about documentation, but what happens at the intersection of the two. One result from our first phase when we were working in the Reggio classrooms is this book, Making Learning Visible, Children as Individual and Group Learners, which shares the perspectives from the United States as well as Reggio Emilia about group learning and documentation, and it contains a number of stories, one of which I'll be sharing in a minute. But we wanted to see, could we take these ideas, bring them back across the Atlantic Ocean, and work in the United States, not just in early childhood, but with teachers through high school, as well as with teacher educators. And one result of that work is this book called Visible Learners, Promoting Reggio-Inspired Approaches in All Schools. But let's dive into an example of a learning group. So in this mini story, which is from the Villetta Preschool, called The City of Reggio, a group of children is given the task to draw their city as part of a larger research project that involves 14 schools on children's understanding of the city. So for almost 6 months, the children and the adults have been asking themselves many questions about their feelings and thoughts and experiences of living in the city. Every class in Reggio has 26 children, but we're going to focus on a small group of boys who work on a map of the city over the course of 2 mornings for about an hour and a half each morning. So now I'm going to read the text prepared by Giovanni Piazza and Angela Barozzi. And the protagonists are Emiliano, Giacomo, and Simone, 3 5-year-old boys. The focus of this fragment is the city, its forms, its relations, its transformations, and its identity, which progressively changes and is redefined in the eyes of the children. This episode describes the thoughts and ideas represented graphically by a group of 3 boys as they design and construct collectively. In the atelier or art studio, 3 5-year-old boys, Emiliano, Simone, and Giacomo, are sitting around a big table with various shapes and sizes of white paper and drawing materials. Their task is to work together to draw a city. Before they begin, the teacher asks the children if they want to listen to their previous conversations and revisit the drawings they had made individually a few days before. And I'm going to read that again because I think it's really important. Before they begin, the teacher asks the children if they want to listen to their previous conversations and revisit the drawings they had made individually a few days before. The boys agree. After some discussion, the 3 boys decide to choose the largest piece of paper on the table. Emiliano says, to make a city that's really big, you need a big piece of paper. Simone, as big as the earth, as big as a city. Emiliano and Simone begin to draw, while Giacomo places himself at the side of the piece of paper. Conversation among the boys is almost absent at the beginning. It seems that the initial agreement about where to start in drawing their city has been enough to enable them to proceed. While Emiliano and Simone sit close together and begin to draw the central square of the city, Giacomo, sitting beside the paper with his elbows on the table and his chin resting on his hands, seems for now to have decided just to observe what happens in this phase. In this first phase, the verbal language that accompanies Emiliano and Simone's graphic representation focuses on the essential. Emiliano, all cities start from a square that's in the middle of a city. Simone, okay, we'll leave space at the bottom to make the street. That way, people can leave and go out. Giacomo still seems not to participate in the group. For the moment, the teacher decides not to urge him to take part. Perhaps it is better to wait for him or the situation to make the decision instead. Meanwhile, Emiliano and Simone are drawing very close together, their hands overlap, they switch seats often, while the curves of the street they are drawing steadily approach Giacomo. Perhaps it is an initial invitation to their friend to take part in the project. Simone, the streets go to so many places and there's one square after another in the city. Emiliano, yeah, otherwise you'd get lost. We'll make it with some curves that go that way, toward where Giacomo is. After about 20 minutes, Simone explicitly invites Giacomo to participate. Giacomo, why aren't you doing anything? His friend's request makes Giacomo slightly uncomfortable, and after this call to participate, he replies, cities have to work, and I have to see if it works. Emiliano, see, Giacomo, this is a different square. It's the one with the field where children play, and the houses are different. This explanation by Emiliano gives Giacomo the possibility of entering into a relationship with the other 2 children by way of an offer of competence. Emiliano, Giacomo, can you draw the roofs of the houses? Come on, try. Giacomo, I know how to make houses with round roofs. Simone, will you help us then? Giacomo, okay. More than 30 minutes have passed since the work began, and in this phase the project becomes more clearly defined. The repetition of certain models, such as the square, facilitates the children's shared planning and executing. Now it is Giacomo who makes proposals. Giacomo, let's make another square. I'm sure there are lots of squares in the city. Simone, should we make one with a soccer player who's practicing? Giacomo, yeah, good idea. The three boys are now working side by side with Simone occupying the central position in the group and engaging his companions in discussion. Just when the whole group has formed, however, it divides again. Emiliano, realizing that all three boys are working in a restricted space, decides to move to the other side of the paper to make the sidewalks. Now Simone and Giacomo form a new pair. The square that is represented also becomes a resting point, a place of conversation, a stimulus for the boys' verbal and graphic development. It seems clear that the streets that are drawn become connections between one square and another, a kind of backbone that progressively traces the outlines of the city as it grows. The city that is developing seems to be defined by the functions carried out inside it. Giacomo. In the squares, there are people talking. Simone. There are pretty squares and ugly ones. Then there are also some squares for parked cars and for soccer players. Emiliano. I think cities that don't have squares are kind of strange. Giacomo. I think they don't work well because the people don't know where to be. Simone. Cities are all connected by the streets and the railroads, right, Giacomo? Giacomo. Well, yeah, the streets are important for keeping the city together and for making it work. Giacomo connects another street to Emiliano's street, while Simone adds the railroad and the playground. The first elements of autobiographical narration emerge. Simone. In the afternoon, I go to play at Campo di Marte Park. Each boy now focuses on his own ideas, and the verbal interaction of the group is suspended. Simone's railroad, Giacomo's streets that lead to the center of town, and Emiliano's small squares that are being added to the map provide new connections and new complexities. As a group, the boys produce their own idea of a city and progressively define the objectives they want to reach together. The ultimate goal is to make an interconnected city. It must be possible to find a path through the whole city, and each boy steadfastly pursues this mission. At this point, the city appears to be such a complex urban web that a pause is needed to check the new connections. Emiliano, we need to see if it's all connected. Simone, yeah, like in real cities. Giacomo, we need to make sure that the whole city is connected and that nobody gets lost. The children think about how to verify this, and they finally agree to go over the streets with their fingers. The test will be carried out by each member of the group, a rule of fairness on which everybody agrees. Emiliano, after having traveled through the city and its connections, gives a new impetus to the work by asking a question. Hey guys, how can you live in the city at night? We don't have any light for the streets. We don't have electricity. This relaunching of the project generates new ideas and requires new roles be taken on in the group. When their work is finished and the children revisit the map with the teacher, they assess not only the aesthetic result of their representation, but also the consistency between the ideas expressed in the group as they worked and the final map of the city. Giacomo, we made a beautiful city even though it's a little bit messy. Emiliano, all the streets take you somewhere. It's a city where you can't get lost, where you're not afraid. Simone, it's a city that could be Reggio Emilia because there's the Campo di Marte Park, but it isn't Reggio. Maybe it's called City of the World because all of the people in the world can live in this city. The city represented by Emiliano, Simone, and Giacomo is one full of functions and connections. The train station, the bus station, the aqueduct, the sewers, and the electrical system are not simply topological landmarks, but are important elements for the real functioning of a city, essential to the life of its people. And just so you don't think that the girls weren't also doing something, I thought I would also share with you the city that the girls created. So now I would like you to turn to the person next to you and talk about what struck you about what you just saw and heard. How did you feel? What were your impressions or your thoughts? So now you can keep talking, but I'd actually like you to turn to another pair and talk about what new thoughts, if any, did this essay trigger for you about teaching and learning more generally. So now maybe slightly bigger groups of 4. Okay, so again, I wish I could hear what you were thinking, but instead, I guess I'll talk about what we see as 4 key features of learning in groups that makes experiences like this so powerful. So these features are not the only features, but I would say that if you don't have them, then maybe something is missing. So the first thing that we did was to define a learning group. And we defined a learning group as, this is a cross-cultural definition, a collection of persons who are emotionally, aesthetically, and intellectually engaged in solving problems, creating products, and making meaning, in which each person learns autonomously and through the ways of learning of others. This took 2 years. And it's a mouthful, and I'm not going to expand on the definition now because I think the features will help to clarify what I mean, except to say that when we are talking about learning groups, we are always also talking about individual learning. In the United States, I don't know about here, we tend to focus on the individual, and sometimes there is a fear that if you focus too much on the group, the individual identity will be lost. We see it as a kind of either or. But in Reggio, they do not think that the group replaces individual learning. Rather, it enhances and builds on this learning. When I first went to Reggio over 20 years ago, I was pregnant with my daughter Daria, and when she was 2, she drew her first picture with colored markers, and I said later, "Tell me about your picture," and she said, "This is a drawing of my colleagues." So just another way to represent the learning group. Okay, so what are the features? First, we would say learning groups include the adults as well as the children. In most schools, even when we engage children in learning in groups, we still see the children as the learners and the adults as the teachers. Parents are seldom mentioned as part of the learning group. But as I mentioned before, in Reggio, schools are seen as sites of pedagogical research, and everybody, adults and children, is seen as contributing to this. Teachers in Reggio generate learning goals for themselves, such as how can we expand and deepen our understanding of children's construction of knowledge and skills. And this is a parent question. What is the role of action figures in children's play? With regard to the city of Reggio, here are the questions that the teachers were asking themselves. What do the children think about their city? How do they feel about it? How do they experience their city with regard to the past, the present, and the future? And I want to share a quote from Loris Malaguzzi, who was the founder of the Reggio approach, that I think is very profound. Malaguzzi said, "The aim of teaching is not to produce learning, but to produce the conditions for learning." And I think in particular, the conditions for children learning from and with each other. So the teachers in Reggio spent a lot of time thinking about the conditions to support children's learning. And here are some questions that they probably spent at least a day coming up with, that they posed to children. Do you know what a city is? What do you think cities are for? Can you tell where a city starts? Can you tell where it ends? Do you think the city has a shape? And then they got more specific. Do you live in a city? What's it called? Do you think it's a big city or a small one? Do you want to try to talk about its colors, sounds, and smells? Again, remember the 100 languages of children. And then what do people do in Reggio Emilia? Little boys and little girls, men and women, moms, dads, teenagers, grandmas, and grandpas. And I think this last question is especially important because it's not stopping at what do people do in the city, but they're always looking for children to be able to encounter and understand multiple perspectives. So it's how does the experience of living in this city differ if you are a child or a teenager or a mother or a grandfather? We worked in the US with teachers and asked them to come up with questions in a monthly seminar to guide their research. So a middle school teacher's question was, how can we involve students in the process of forming groups? which tasks are best suited for individual learning and which for the group. It's actually not that easy to come up with a task that genuinely requires the group in order for it to be completed successfully. And then a high school English teacher's question was, how can I use documentation to create a more equitable learning environment and demonstrate the value of equity in our learning together? So, second feature, documenting children's learning helps to make it visible and shapes the learning that takes place. I'm going to put up a definition that took us 10 years to come up with, and I'm not kidding. And I'm not saying this is the right definition of documentation. I am saying we thought long and hard about every word. So we would define documentation as the practice of 4 verbs: observing, recording, interpreting, and sharing through different media, so not just words and not just images, but some of each, the processes and products of learning, and then why are you documenting to begin with? In order to deepen learning. So I want to stress this last point, in order to deepen learning. Documentation, or making learning visible, is not an end in itself. Sometimes we get so focused on learning to document that we forget about documenting to learn. Documentation makes learning visible when it focuses on some aspect of learning, not just what you did, and when it promotes conversation and deepens understanding about children's thinking and effective teaching. But documentation can be thought of in many different ways, so I'll share a few other ways of thinking about it. You could consider it a kind of visible listening, using the walls to advance learning, a memory for the group, making children's or adults' work available for re-examination, and a political act. So I'll just share a few examples to demonstrate what I mean by some of these terms. With regard to memory for the group, Melissa Tonishell is a kindergarten teacher we worked with who wanted to build a culture of group learning in her classroom, and she thought it was essential to begin with the language that children used. So whenever they used words that supported learning from and with each other, she would write them down and put them up as a resource for the class. Making children's work available for re-examination. You may remember that the teachers in the beginning asked the boys if they wanted to revisit their drawings or listen to the conversations they had had previously. We worked with a school in Ohio, and after documenting for a while, the 3rd grade teacher, Cindy Gildersleeve, said, "Before, I listened to children, but always felt my best teaching occurred when I was interacting with or instructing students. Now I believe that the best teaching occurs after I have listened carefully to the conversations children have, reflected on those conversations, and used my reflections to guide my interactions with the students." Finally, documentation is also a political act, because what we document reveals what we value and the type of learning that we think is important for the type of world that we want to live in. This is a public exhibition of what teachers learned about student learning at the Wycliffe School in Ohio that sought to challenge our notions of what learning looks like. So people in the community were invited, like school board members and the governor and his wife, other teachers from other schools. And we would say it's all well and good to critique standardized tests, but if what we measure or assess is what we value, it's not enough to critique standardized testing without offering an alternative. So we would say documentation is an effort to make important learning visible that is often not captured on standardized tests. Learning like students listening to and learning from each other, using their imaginations, thinking critically and creatively, developing a sense of aesthetics and emotional understanding, and understanding what it means to be members of a democratic society. The third feature is that learning groups attend to the emotional and aesthetic as well as intellectual dimensions of learning. The neuroscientist Mary Helen Immordino Yang says, it is literally neurobiologically impossible to think deeply about things that you don't care about. One of the reasons those boys stayed with the city of Reggio over such a long period is because they had strong feelings about it. What do we mean by the aesthetic dimension? Well, we don't really know, but here's what we think. We'd say the aesthetic dimensions of learning engage us in learning more by stirring the emotions, the senses, and the mind in deep ways, often making the ordinary extraordinary. And you can think about the aesthetic dimension in three ways. The most concrete is the setup of the environment and the quality and nature of the materials that draw the group in and get them to want to learn more. Second, we often think about aesthetics with regard to a product. But could you say that a learning process could be aesthetic? A process that encourages curiosity, intimacy, affection, the desire to learn with others. And then finally, and this is the most abstract, we would say, is there such a thing as a beautiful idea? Ideas that both please you and please others. And so that's probably the most abstract level of this dimension. Now finally, the fourth feature of learning in groups. We would say learning groups are a lot like scientific communities or the disciplines, in that they focus on building collective as well as individual knowledge. So for us, the group means both the learning of the individuals and a more distributed kind of learning that does not reside in the head of any one person. So even before children begin an activity in Reggio, they ask them, what can we do to remember what you did and communicate it to others? A fifth grade teacher that we worked with, Maureen Reedy, changed the question she asked students in her ecosystem unit to add these words in red. What's important for others to know? How can we share what we learned with others? And she said she maybe asked these questions before at the end of a unit, but now she was asking them earlier. The final product of the City of Reggio was this book, A Guide to the City by the children. And to share another example with you, this is a permanent installation at the train station of children's drawings and theories and thoughts about bicycles and how they work. So, in closing, I want to share one example from Boston that we were inspired to do. So this is just a little bit of the demographics about Boston and a project called Children Are Citizens. And this is an image of the mayor and some of the 4,000 kindergarten students in City Hall, and these children 3 months earlier had received a letter from the mayor. And in that letter, the mayor said, what suggestions do you have about construction in our city to make Boston a fairer and more interesting place for children? And this is one class's idea. It's a park where parents have to play with their kids and a rule that parents have to put their cell phones in lockers. Okay, to return to the leaf question. This was a question my son asked. And I would have answered the way maybe some of you did. And I did at first. I said, what do you think? And Caleb didn't say anything. His name is Caleb. And it could have ended there. But then I said, do you have any ideas? And Caleb said, maybe people come around and find them on the ground and pick them up and put them back on the trees. Here is where my experience with Reggio educators I made a move that would not have occurred to me before. I might have said, that's interesting, or something along those lines. But instead I said, why don't you talk to the other kids in your class and see what they think? Remember Malaguzzi's quote, setting up the conditions for children to learn from and with each other. This type of move costs no money and takes no resources. So I want to end with a quote from John Dewey, the American philosopher, which I think is especially fitting for our time. Dewey wrote this in 1937. He said, wherever democracy has fallen, it was too exclusively political in nature. It had not become part of the bone and blood of the people in daily conduct of its life. Democratic forms were limited to parliament elections and combats between parties. Sound familiar? What is happening proves conclusively, I think, that unless democratic habits of thought and action are part of the fiber of a people, political democracy is insecure. It cannot stand in isolation. It must be buttressed by the presence of democratic methods in all social relationships. The relations that exist in educational institutions are second only in importance in this respect to those which exist in industry and business, perhaps not even to them. And in the words of the kindergarten teacher, Melissa Tonishell, with whom we worked, she now, when she has parent-child teacher conferences, says, "Your child's education is not an individual pursuit." Thank you.
Thank you, Mara, for a stimulating lecture. The inspiration that we all feel about early childhood education in Reggio Emilia is exemplified in your talk, as well as what you and your team at Project Zero have been doing for many years, most particularly in the Making Learning and Thinking Visible project and the Pedagogy of Play project. Your ideas resonate with the pedagogical repertoires of many Australian early childhood educators. We draw inspiration from the Reggio pedagogistas, and I would like to share with you an Australian example of the ways in which this work is manifested in our early childhood context. We believe that the ideas and practices that you have presented are what the future of children's learning in the early childhood years from birth to 8 should look like. And they illustrate what you have referred to tonight in terms of the power of the group as a learning environment and how pedagogical documentation can shape and deepen children's learning. I collaborated with the Department for Education in South Australia on the STEM Bridge project, and I'm pleased that Christine Stevenson from the department is here tonight, because it was a pleasure to work with Christine, Michael Austin, Joe Haynes and Kim Naderbaum in this project. Because again, it not only exemplifies what you have been talking about tonight, but also the commitment, enthusiasm and engagement of the teachers to transform their pedagogies to enhance the children's learning was infectious. Our project builds on your ideas and created opportunities for pedagogical conversations between early childhood educators that helped to shape transformative practices. The project was initiated by the Department for Education in South Australia in order to create context for collaborations between preschool educators and reception teachers, which is the first year of primary school in South Australia, with the support of their educational leaders. STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths learning ecologies provided the basis of the project. STEM education in the early years provides a framework for designing active learning ecologies that connect with children's natural curiosity about their world. It engages children in authentic investigations using critical and creative thinking in systematic ways to build knowledge, acquire skills, and cultivate confident dispositions for learning. Here, the notion of learning ecologies was that they are learning spaces where there was a dynamic relationship between the physical and human elements, characterized by a reciprocity of learning between the children and adults, and children and community members. Our goal was to create learning ecologies that resonated with both preschool and school goals for learning. These learning ecologies would incorporate pedagogical repertoires that were seamless and integrated to support the continuity of children's learning in their new school environment. Our approach was to view children as capable learners who were articulate, that is, able to communicate their ideas, feelings and discoveries in different ways, showing how they understand and make meaning in their life worlds, respectful, working collaboratively within communities of practice, listening and questioning and striving for common and multiple goals in their explorations, knowledgeable, being able to support their plans and actions with accurate and relevant data to illustrate logical and creative thinking in diverse contexts from an ethical perspective. We worked with a wonderful filmmaker, Hugh Fenton, so I'm able to share with you our documentation of some of the transformations listed here on the slide in 3 minutes, 53 seconds. So it's invigorating to me to hear about how you've embraced that change in your pedagogy. The traditional view of transition is that the preschool teacher gets a child ready for school. But there's a reciprocity and openness in your conversations.
It is really important that reception students do transition well because that sets them up for their future learning.
In early childhood, the curriculum is much more responsive. You're thinking on your feet. You're continually changing the direction that you go because children's ideas will make you do that.
And I think that's the important thing for educators to know, that through play, yes, they are playing, but it's our job to pull that curriculum out.
Do you think there's going to be enough bricks to help me get from here to there without touching the lava?
Yes. We plan in regards to what they're interested in, rather than us deciding from the curriculum what they're going to be learning today.
It's creating that motivation. If you're listening to their voice, you're seeing what motivates them, what ideas are they playing with, what concepts are they wanting to explore. And so if you can tap into that, then you get the increased engagement because you're exploring something that's meaningful to them.
And then you can link it directly into going and trying it in the class.
Yes.
Let's measure.
Yeah,
definitely. The area of this space.
Perimeter.
Yeah.
And
the difference between just presenting material to the children and coming in through their interests, the engagement level is beyond belief.
Right, the circle.
So I think the strength of what we've done here, using pedagogical practices that the students are familiar with, and to bring them gently into the ways of school.
Where I started to notice little things that children were doing. They were more critically and creatively thinking.
Okay. That's not going to work. We can string it to another tree.
I appreciate the difficulty of working within a classroom, but it's also about how your environment is set up to support your ability to support groups of learners.
When you are in a classroom and you're seeing students excited and engaged, you know that you have undeniably tapped into something that is remarkable. It's better than any computer, it's better than any smart board.
Also helps them to connect their memories to things they did at kindy, and I think that helps them to develop a sense of belonging.
For us, these amazing teachers were so articulate in describing their work. In fact, one of the most important comments they made was when they told us that they felt that working in the project had given them the professional language to talk about their work in this collaborative space. In part of her reflective summation of the project, Trish wrote, "This project has provided me with the opportunity to experience and support learners in a play-based environment. Educators mentor and support each other around possibilities as we reflect and modify our practices. For example, feeling supported and having permission to continue with sustained interactions in play spaces." We have this overview and also longer videos from each of the 6 sites in this project, which will form the basis of the findings from the project, and they'll be able to be shared with other early childhood educators in South Australia. These include narratives from the educators, pedagogical documentation panels, and individual learning video vignettes. We took seriously the comments of one of the teachers. "I didn't know I could do it, change that is, until I saw what was possible. It was making the process of learning visible. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola, for that Australian example, which I think followed on really nicely from what Mara shared with us. I have a very easy job and a very quick job this evening, and I won't keep you any longer because I know we're running a little bit of overtime. But I just wanted to, first of all, thank Mara for travelling to be with us. We've had some wonderful conversations already, and I think tonight has just raised a whole lot of other questions for us. But I also can't let anybody leave tonight without thanking Jenny, who has made this possible through her commitment and with the support of John and her family, for us to be able to be developing the REEaCH Hub and the network of educators, the seminars and the dissemination of information. So thank you very much, Jenny. And